Mitch Greenhill has a book he recently wrote called Raised by Musical Mavericks, recalling life lessons from Pete Seeger, Lightnin' Hopkins, Doc Watson, Reverend Gary Davis, and others. And Mitch Greenhill is on the line. Mitch, welcome to WLRN.
Thank you, Michael. Happy to be here.
Well, first of all, thank you so much for writing this. It was such a joy reading, and it filled in a lot of blank spaces that I really am really curious about. The 60s folk revival, and you were right there smack in the middle. You were there not in the Greenwich Village side, but in the Boston, Massachusetts side.
Right. I spent a fair amount of time in the Village, and actually that's where I'm at the moment. I think that one of the big differences was that in New York, if you were playing, the Gaslight or the Bitter End or any of those clubs, there would always be in the back of your mind some idea that somebody important might be in the audience. Somebody from Columbia Records, or I think Bill Cosby had that gig at the Gaslight, and that's where he got his break. Whereas in Boston, we knew there was going to be nobody particularly important, and so we could just make mistakes without having to worry about it, I guess.
Was your intention to make it to Greenwich Village?
At the time, I had a much more art for art's sake and purity for purity's sake attitude. Although I always hoped that my devotion to the pure art would somehow lead me to something bigger.
Well, you certainly rub shoulders with things a lot bigger. You were a student at Harvard. You did graduate, right?
I managed to graduate from there. It's a funny thing. The people who came to Boston to study at Boston University, they all dropped out. Joan Baez, Jim Queskin, my first wife, Louise, and those of us who were in Harvard somehow managed to buckle down. Maybe it's because we were just across the street from the Club 47. I don't know. But I don't know. No matter how much I wanted to rebel against my parents, I was the necessity of that college education was drilled into me too deep. So I figured I'd just, work it out, work it through. First couple of years in college, or I guess in my sophomore year, I was considering more of an academic path.
But you are a musician. Your father was a big influence on you. In fact, you grew up with a lot of musicians because your dad was in the business. When did he become a music promoter?
My dad came up in the labor movement of New York City, and I think he got into the music that way. He heard the Almanac Singers, Pete Seeger and Woody Guthrie and the gang coming up. As a matter of fact, he took some lessons from Josh White, who was the first major concert that he promoted was Josh White. He was working an advertising business in Boston, meaning, what would he do? He would represent the foreign language papers. Like one of my early jobs was calling up people, cold calling people and saying, hey, the big Pulaski Day edition of the Polish Daily Courier is coming up. Why don't you place an ad? And along the line, man, he started presenting little, I guess I called it late night hoots. Started presenting things in Harvard Square that would start at 11 or midnight. And then at a certain point, he decided to do something bigger. He wanted to present Pete Seeger in concert. And that's the start of the company that my son and I run today, Folklore Productions, or Fly Artists, as we've recently rebranded. And it's hard to remember how, informal the scene was in those days. But when Pete Seeger and Sonny Terry, who was performing with him, came to town to do that concert, they didn't stay in a hotel. They stayed with us in our spare bedrooms. And I was 13 years old at the time, very impressionable. And these powerhouse musicians showed up, Pete and Sonny Terry, later on, Lightnin' Hopkins and Reverend Gary Davis, John Jacob Niles, a whole bunch of powerhouses, forces of nature would just come through the place. And I was pretty much blown away and blown in their updraft.
How much did your father have to do with Joan Baez's success?
Quite a bit, I think. He met Joan I mentioned that he was, politically conscious guy. He went to a meeting of, I think it was called Concerned Scientists Against Nuclear Bombs or something like that. And Joan's father, Al Baez, who was a physicist, was speaking there. And after he spoke, or in the middle of his speech, he introduced his 16-year-old daughter to sing a couple of songs. And that's where Manny and Joan met. And then maybe a year later, Al was, his gig at Boston University was over. He went on to another academic gig, but Joan had already started developing a bit of a following at the 47 in Boston. And so Al basically asked Manny to, look after his teenage daughter. And Manny managed Joan for 14, 15 years, including, her big initial successes, the cover of Time magazine, all the concerts in the South that were the first integrated concerts in a lot of places. So yes, a very important part of our history.
I'm talking to Mitch Greenhill. His latest book is Raised by, is it your only book? Is this your first book?
This is my first book. This is it. But I have something else in the works. We'll find out.
Raised by Musical Mavericks is Mitch's book, and we're talking about the folk revival of the 1960s because Mitch was there. And I mentioned you fill in some of the blanks for me because I have this old album by Ralph Kahn and Eric von Schmidt, and I finally found out who Ralph Kahn is. Tell me who Ralph Kahn is.
Ralph Kahn was where do I start? He was a German Jew who had escaped Germany as Hitler was coming in there, although there was always these stories that he was spying behind the lines for the Allies and whatnot. He came to America and became very interested in folk music and blues in particular. And then when he was based in California, then when he came out to our place, he stayed with us for it kind of was months, I think, until I finally my family finally put him to work teaching me guitar. And I for a long time I thought that this quasi-German accent he had was how people spoke in the Mississippi Delta. Took me a while to kind of figure it out. But he was my first serious guitar teacher, even when he moved out and set up shop in Cambridge. I would go there on the subway, and taught me a lot about guitar, and was a good mentor to me.
One of my regrets, I first started in radio in Tampa, and it was my first week at the station, volunteering, of course, and they said, "You want to go to Sarasota, interview Eric von Schmidt?" And I chickened out. But Eric is a giant. Eric, he should be better known because of his wide scope of art that he does.
I totally agree, and I don't know. I might have been at Saratoga that winter. I spent a couple of winters hanging out in his neighborhood down there. He was, in addition to being a powerful singer and guitarist, he was a painter of renown. He's painted large paintings. His father, Harold von Schmidt, was also widely exhibited, did a lot of those Saturday Evening Post covers of Western life. A powerful guy. And actually, when Rolf and he started working, I eventually, and then Rolf left town, I eventually drifted over to and adopted Eric as my mentor. I think I was always looking for the older brother that I never had. He was, I think, the best man at my wedding, now that I think about it. And I wound up producing an album of his as things went on. Backed him up a lot of times at the 47.
One of my favorite albums is, was it Second Row, Third Right? Wet Birds Don't Fly at Night is on there. That wasn't the album you produced, was it?
No, I produced Who Knocked the Brains Out of the Sky. The one you're mentioning, I think, is the first album he did of all his own material.
It's a great album, and also featured on that album is Jeff Moldauer. Is that how you pronounce Jeff's last name?
Moldor.
Jeff Moldor, and he was another Boston folk singer that you became friendly with.
Oh, Jeff and I were very tight. As a matter of fact, Jeff and Maria and my first wife, Louise, and I were a foursome. We would get together a couple of times a week to shoot the breeze, play music, see a concert who was around there. Jeff was a more strict mentor than Eric. He had very, probably still does, has very strong ideas of what is good, what isn't, and if you fall on the wrong side of that line, you're going to hear about it in no uncertain terms. And he had the knowledge and the chops to back it up.
Mitch Greenhill is on the line. His book is called Raised by Musical Mavericks. Jeff Muldaur, along with Jim Kweskin, became very popular with the Jug Band. It seems like America, in the 50s, there was the calypso music that Harry Belafonte made popular, and then the Kingston Trio with the folk music, and then the Jug Band music became very popular. Why weren't you in a jug band?
There's a good question. I don't know. I actually filled in for Queskin on in that jug band when in the '80s when Tom Rush was running his Symphony Hall New Year's concerts. So I guess that was my chance. I don't know. I hung out with those guys quite a bit. Jeff always used to. I think at one point, some interviewer once asked Jeff, "Why are you playing good time music?" And he said, "Well, if we lived in good times, we'd play bad time music."
But it's amazing. I mean, how surprised were you that the jug band became as popular as they did?
We were always surprised when somebody from our little niche of the stratosphere managed to soar. And I remember we were really excited when they were on the Tonight Show, I think, or one of those things. I also remember hanging out with them in California. I think I had just moved to California, and they were on the Pat Boone show, and so I hung out with them there, and was shocked to see Pat Boone smoking a cigar. It didn't really fit his image.
Oh, that's great. So we have the jug band music, and I guess the Beatles knocked the jug band and folk music out of the charts at all. Do you remember the first time you heard the Beatles?
I think, as with most everybody else, I heard them on the Ed Sullivan Show at that time, and I thought they were, really good. It kind of surprised me how good they were.
There were so many divisions. I mean, it seems like back in the '60s, the folk musicians, there were real radical folk musicians, and it's like the New Law City Ramblers represented the real traditional folk, and Dylan upset the whole thing at bringing rock and roll into it. Where did you stand in that line of what is folk music?
I was always pretty receptive to the electrical end of things. I've always found it a little odd that in the purest folk music circles, an electric bass is considered an acoustic instrument, but a trap drum set is not. It just doesn't kind of make sense now, does it? I was at the Newport Folk Festival when Dylan went electric. Didn't sound that. I was a little disappointed in the sound, actually. I'd been very interested in the Paul Butterfield band that summer. Matter of fact, from when they started, when I went out to Chicago to see some friends and hopefully get into University of Chicago, is when I first heard Butterfield and Nick Gravenitis. And I mean, Michael Bloomfield is just a superb player, and he and I became pretty close. As I say, the Dylan thing at Newport did not knock me out, but it didn't offend me. I mean, I think we forget that Dylan already had a record out that summer. It wasn't Positively 4th Street or one of his early records. So to me, I wasn't at all surprised that he showed up with an electric band. I was like, that's what was on the radio. Why wouldn't he? But as I say, I thought it sounded kind of messy. Although I've heard a cleaned up version recently, and it sounds pretty good. So maybe I was in a wrong head at the time.
Mitch Greenhill's new book is called Raised by Musical Mavericks, primarily because your dad was in the business, and he introduced you to some really incredible artists, from Lightnin' Hopkins and Pete Seeger and other artists who slept in your house. I imagine they slept over your house to save money, so your dad could make more money on the concerts he was presenting.
I suppose we didn't, at that point I was a teenager. I wasn't dealing in the bookkeeping with it at all. I hadn't really thought about it. it was also kind of more of a family scene. I remember Reverend Davis would, first place, Reverend Davis is blind, so putting him in a hotel is problematic in a sense. And then he would, being a blind man, he wouldn't let the guitar out of his hand. So then he sat on our living room couch and just played for hours, whereas I would be soaking it up. My dad actually fronted the money for that guitar. He got a call from a music store downtown, and proprietor was saying, this old guy here playing the guitar, he won't let it go. He says you're good for it, And so my dad did front the $500 for that Miss Gibson, as Reverend Davis called it. And then in the mornings, he would ask my mom to sanctify his coffee, meaning pouring a little of the spirit into it.
You mentioned in your book the first time you had gin was because who was it who turned you on to gin? And does your dad know about that?
No, it was Lightning Hopkins did it, and no, my dad didn't know about it. I had just gotten my driver's license, and my job was to drive Lightning Hopkins around to a couple of concerts he did in New England. One of them was down at Yale University. And on the way back, he made quick use of a bottle of gin, and I have to admit I helped a little bit.
So what happened to you? Did it turn you? How did that affect you?
Certainly being with Lightning affected me. He was a powerful musician and a powerful force. I haven't really kept up my taste for gin.
But you were thrust into an adult world. Here you are, a kid, and I'm sure you came across a lot of situations that other kids did not come across.
This is true, and I think I probably didn't handle it all that well. My way of handling it was to pretend I knew more than I did, and I probably got caught out a few times because I didn't know nothing. Basically, I was just hanging on for dear life. But the musicians were always, for the most part, were always really protective and helpful for me. You mentioned the Kingston Trio, and their hit song was Tom Dooley that one year in 50, whatever it was. But then when we started working with Doc Watson, he actually knew the families there, and he had strong opinions on what happened to Tom Dooley. He knew that somebody had confessed on their deathbed. It happened down the road a piece from where he lived. So that was a level of intimacy with the music, that was hardwired for him, and that was a learning experience.
Did the Kingston Trio in your folk circles were they too commercial for you?
I guess when they first came out, it was kind of exciting. But, pretty soon we moved on to what seemed more serious fare, more real stuff.
Speaking about serious fare, I mean, a lot was going on in the 60s, from the Vietnam War and the March on Washington and the assassinations. You were at the March of Washington.
Yeah, I think everybody in our family was there. I had actually spent a couple of weeks earlier that summer helping voter registration drive in Cambridge, Maryland. Gloria Richardson, I think, was the name of the leader at that time, which was, I think it was a Congress for Racial Equality thing. And then we got the March on Washington. Yeah, everybody had to be there. August 28th, 1963, I think it was. I, at that point, was much more interested in hearing what John Lewis had to say. And after he spoke, which I gather he had to tone down his remarks. And I had been up all night because I had been hitchhiking there. I got a ride with these 5 guys in a big black Cadillac and a bottle of 4 roses. I was kind of out of it at that point. So I kind of drifted off at a certain point. So I have to take everybody's word for it that Martin Luther King gave a pretty good speech there, because I didn't hear it.
Mitch Greenhill is on the line. Raised by Musical Mavericks is his book. It's such an enjoyable read. And eventually, you went into your father's business. Was that a tough decision?
It was a little bit. I was kind of committed to being on the creative side, performing and writing songs and whatnot. but it wasn't going very well. I was in 1976. I found myself playing top 40 music at a lounge in East Boston. I had been to California, moved back. I'd had a happening band in California, and that broke up, and just didn't seem like there was much moving forward. Manny was going through a bit of a crisis, or it seemed to me, because Baez had left him. And so I felt I could help him out. I think he was feeling he could help me out. And so we decided to try it out for a year. I came in as, I think I was the musical director of the company for a year. And so first thing I did was I started transcribing Doc Watson guitar solos, which was pretty educational, because the Library of Congress was being rather strict at that time on copyrighting your versions of traditional songs. So I had to kind of prove that there was original material going on there. But then at a certain point, I started booking. I think first thing I booked was a tour by Tom Paley, who had been in the New Lost City Ramblers. And gosh, it's amazing. As soon as you start booking, people start returning your phone calls, and there was a little more status to the thing. And so I just kind of went with it. And then, of course, when I guess the key thing for me was when Merle Watson asked me to help him as he was producing an album and having some problems with it. And so I wound up producing several albums for the Watsons, and that was like a dream come true. I'd always just loved their music and respected them a bunch. And to get into the Nashville scene a little bit.
You have a Doc Watson project coming up?
Well, I'm one of the executive producers of something called I Am a Pilgrim, Doc Watson at 100. As we speak now, it's available as digital downloads, and God willing, we're going to get some CDs and vinyl before too long. It's this 2023 is the 100th anniversary of Doc's birth. So we on our fledgling record company, my son Matt and I started a record label in the middle of the pandemic. I guess because we were looking for something to do. It seems like a silly thing to do in a certain way, because nobody even has CD players anymore. But we did. We put out a few albums. The Campbell Brothers tribute to Coltrane's Love Supreme. We put out a Doc and Merle instrumental album. Put out Dave Van Ronk's jug band version of Peter and the Wolf. But then with this tribute album, it's funny, you start asking people, do they want to participate in a Doc Watson tribute album? And Dolly Parton says, sure. Roseanne Cash says, okay. And Bill Frisell says yes. And then some younger people, Valerie June and Critter from the Punch Brothers. So it's actually quite an array of artists on our little, as we like to call it, boutique label. And I'm getting a crash course in the world of streaming and algorithms, which is kind of how it all works these days in the what passes for a record business.
It sounds like you're excited about it.
I am. It's I think the record's a really good record, and it's and I certainly like the idea of paying tribute to Doc. I think he deserves all he can get.
Mitch Greenhill is on the line, and before we finish up, I don't want to, because this Doc Watson album is new, but we're talking about Folklore Productions. That's a company your father started, and it's now Fly International?
Fly Artists. Fly is in addition to sounding hip, is a acronym for Folklore International. And
that's because of your son's influence.
Yes, exactly. And it also turned out that some of the artists, especially some of the African artists, they like that better, it seems. So we're working with it. Although Folklore Productions still exists. It's it's our legal name. DBA is FLI.
One of my favorite concerts. I used to produce concerts before I had this radio show. The concerts helped me get this job. But one of my favorite concerts, I believe I dealt with you. I produced Dave Van Ronk here in South Florida. Talking about an underrated artist, and you wouldn't know it, but the guy is an incredible singer. I was just so blown away by Dave Van Ronk's show.
Yeah, he described himself as a cabaret singer, which I think is pretty accurate. Matter of fact, I was just involved with, or kind of kibitzing on Mike Regenstrife's radio show. He did a show on the on music of Bertolt Brecht. and featured an album that I had almost forgotten about, Dave Van Ronk and Frankie Armstrong singing Kurt Weill and Bertolt Brecht songs. And I think, that's, I think, his meat and potatoes, right in that kind of half sarcastic, half sincere world. And if you approach his blues in that fashion, I think it makes sense. And he was a wonderful cat. My wife and I just had dinner with his widow, Andrea, last night, and we keep very much in touch.
You never slept on his couch in Greenwich Village, did you?
I did. Oh, for sure. I think I was playing on, he did an album called Songs for Aging Children that I play on, and during that time I certainly slept on that famous couch.
Mitch Greenhill, his book is called Raised by Musical Mavericks. Are you surprised you've lasted this long? This is a generation that's disappearing, Mitch, and is that why you wrote the book?
Kind of. I had these kind of stories that I would tell every now and then after the pint or two, and people kept saying, well, you should write this stuff down. So eventually I got started on it, and it was a little harder than I thought. It's a little more challenging to put stuff in a structured form than shooting the breeze in the bar at night. But at a certain point, I kind of found the voice, and I said, okay, whatever I do from here on in, I'll just want to hold on to that. And I wound up enjoying the process. They say that all writing is rewriting, and I think that's quite true. And it got to the point where, I would enjoy getting back in there. I finished it up during the pandemic. The pandemic was very helpful in that regard. So I'm working right now on I guess it's a novel about similar stuff set in the music world. And I've kind of created these characters and I see them as kind of my imaginary friends. So I just kind of like to go hang out with them a while, see what they're going to come up with.
I was going to mention some names that are probably now obscure, but you're intimate with these folks. Cisco Houston, did you meet Cisco Houston?
Oh yeah, he stayed at our house a number of times. He and my mom became pretty good friends. I remember he was staying there just a few months before he died. He was already pretty sick and frail, and it was surprising he still was a great looking guy at that point, even though he was going down. And a guy who was very committed politically. Of Woody Guthrie's compatriots, he and Pete were probably the most committed politically to the struggle that was involved there.
Another artist who just released a composition album a little while ago was Barbara Dane. I believe she lives out on the West Coast.
Yeah, I was kind of in touch with her not that long ago. She and Ralph Kahn had been married actually way back when, and they have a son, Jesse, who's taken a different political path, I think. Barbara, my friend Judah Schombaum kind of works as an amanuensis to Barbara, who is still in pretty good shape, feisty at 95 years old, and carrying the banner.
Mitch Greenhill is on the line. One last thing, I think I read in your book, did you see Paul Robeson perform?
That was my first concert. I was maybe 5 years old. We were living in Brooklyn, and my mom, I remember we got on the subway and we got out of the subway in Manhattan. There was lots of cars. It was kind of scary. And then we entered the concert hall. I don't know where it was, maybe Town Hall. I remember we were in the balcony. And I remember it as a safe place. And then Robeson came out on the stage. It was a children's concert. He was doing kids' songs like Shorten and Bread. And I remember his voice just seemed to envelop me and everybody else in the place. And that was kind of where I kind of first had the feeling that, I need to get inside this music. There's something really wonderful going on there, and I want to be inside it. I want to be part of that.
Mitch Greenhill, Raised by Musical Mavericks, recalling life lessons from Pete Seeger, Lightnin' Hopkins, Doc Watson, Reverend Gary Davis, and others. Like I mentioned, it was such a fun read, and seeing all the names in there that I've known for years, and filling in details. Mitch, thank you for writing this book.
Oh, thank you. Appreciate your interest.